from every other catastrophe you've ever heard of. Nobody knew what caused it. Nobody knew if it would end. And nobody, not a single person alive at the time, had any way of knowing that what they were experiencing was just the beginning. Let's start with the morning the sun stopped working. It didn't disappear. It didn't go dark in a dramatic eclipse. It simply dimmed. Byzantine historian Procopius recorded what he saw in 536 with the careful confusion of someone trying to describe something that had no precedent. He wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, and it seemed very like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear. This went on for a year and a half. Not a day, not a week. 18 months of a sun that looked wrong. A sun that gave light but not warmth. A sky that was perpetually overcast by something that was not clouds. The temperature across the northern hemisphere dropped between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees Celsius within a year, which doesn't sound like much until you understand what that does to crops. Summer temperatures in Europe dropped enough to prevent grain from maturing. Snow fell in China in August. Drought hit Peru. Famine spread across the entire northern hemisphere within 2 years. The people living through this had no word for what was happening. They had no concept of climate, no understanding of the relationship between volcanic ash and atmospheric temperature, no framework that could contain an event of this scale. What they had was religion, and religion told them this was the end. But here's where it gets strange, because the fog of 536 didn't just happen once. Scientists analyzing ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, the most precise climate records the planet produces, found evidence of not one but two additional massive volcanic eruptions in 540 and 547, 3 eruptions in 11 years, each one adding more sulfur dioxide to the atmosphere, each one extending the dimming, the cooling, the crop failures. The people who survived the first famine were barely recovering when the second wave of cold arrived. And then in 541 AD, 5 years after the fog first appeared, something that had been absent from Europe for nearly 2 centuries returned. The plague, not a small outbreak, not a regional epidemic. The plague of Justinian, the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague in human history, emerged in Egypt and swept through the Byzantine Empire, the Sassanid Persian Empire, and across the Mediterranean world with a speed and lethality that contemporary accounts struggled to contain in language. John of Ephesus, a bishop traveling through Egypt in 541, wrote that he walked through fields of standing grain that no one was left alive to harvest. He wrote of roads littered with the dead. He wrote of entire villages that had ceased to exist, not because they had been attacked, but because everyone in them had simply died. At its peak in Constantinople, the plague of Justinian was killing an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 people per day. The city had run out of space to bury them. Emperor Justinian ordered ships to carry the bodies out to sea and dump them. He ordered ancient towers opened as mass graves. He ran out of those too. Between 541 and 750 AD, the plague of Justinian killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, roughly 13 to 26% of the entire population of the known world. But what researchers discovered when they connected the volcanic record to the plague record was the thing that changed how historians understood this entire period. The plague didn't appear in a healthy world. It appeared in a world that had already been starving for 5 years. Populations that had been weakened by famine, whose immune systems were compromised by years of nutritional deficiency, whose social structures had been destabilized by the economic collapse that follows prolonged crop failure. These were the populations the plague hit. Medieval historian Kyle Harper at the University of Oklahoma spent years reconstructing the intersection of climate and disease in the late antique world. What he found was that the volcanic winter of 536 didn't just cause famine, it created the exact biological and social conditions in which plague could achieve maximal lethality. The fog came first, the cold followed, the famine came after the cold, the social collapse came after the famine, and into that collapsed, weakened, starving world, the plague arrived. Each disaster made the next one worse. Each catastrophe removed one more layer of resilience from the people trying to survive it. Now here's the part that most historians don't talk about, because the numbers, 50 million dead, temperature collapse, famine across the hemisphere, these are enormous, but numbers don't capture what it was actually like to be a person alive in 536. What it was actually like was this. You woke up one morning in early 536 and the sky looked wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly off. The sun was there, but it felt distant. The warmth it usually brought didn't come. You planted your crops anyway, because that's what you did. The crops didn't grow properly, the harvest was thin. You ate carefully through the winter, rationing what you had, hoping the next spring would be better. The next spring was worse. The sun was still dim. The temperatures were still wrong. Your children were hungry in a way that went beyond a bad season. This wasn't a drought you could understand. This wasn't a war you could flee. This was the sky itself, behaving in a way it had never behaved before. And nobody around you had any explanation. Your priest told you it was punishment. Your leaders told you nothing because they had nothing to tell. The most educated people in the world, Byzantine scholars, Persian astronomers, Chinese court scientists, were all looking at the same wrong sky and reaching for religious frameworks because scientific ones didn't exist yet. In 541, the person next to you developed a fever, then a swelling, then within days they were dead, and then the person on the other side of you, and then your children. Imagine watching the world end without a single piece of information that told you why. Scientists later discovered that the culprit for the 536 fog was a volcanic eruption in Iceland, identified through analysis of ash particles found in ice cores drilled in 2018 by glaciologist Sebastien Guillet and his team. The eruption had been so massive that it ejected enough sulfuric particles into the stratosphere to block a meaningful portion of sunlight reaching the northern hemisphere. The people who survived it had no idea. They never knew. They lived through what we can now model and measure and explain with precision, and they died without the comfort of understanding a single thing that had happened to them. That asymmetry between what we know now and what they knew then is the most haunting thing about 536, because the worst part wasn't the cold, it wasn't the famine, it wasn't even the plague, it was the silence, the complete absence of any explanation in a world that needed one desperately. The period between 536 and roughly 660 AD, a little over a century, has been identified by climate scientists, archaeologists, and historians as the late antique Little Ice Age, a sustained period of cooling, crop failure, population collapse, and pandemic that fundamentally reshaped the political, religious, and demographic map of the entire world. The Eastern Roman Empire, which had seemed on the verge of reconquering the Western Mediterranean under Justinian, never recovered its strength. The power vacuum created by the plague opened space for the rapid expansion of Islam across the Middle East and North Africa in the 7th century. The demographic collapse of the Persian Sassanid Empire contributed to its fall to Arab armies in 651. A fog in 536 reshaped the world, and the people who lived through it, who planted their crops in wrong-colored light, who buried their children in mass graves, who watched the known world dissolve around them without a single word of explanation from anyone. They are the answer to the question. The worst day to be alive in ancient times wasn't a single day. It was every day for 125 years, beginning on an unremarkable morning in 536, when someone looked up at the sky and thought, something is wrong. And they were right. They just had no idea how wrong.